Welcome to this WineGB webinar on preparation of the winery for harvest. I'm Jo Caldroy and WineGB's Operations Manager, and I'll just quickly introduce our three speakers for today. So we have Sam Armstrong, who's Service Engineer at BevTech Limited. BevTech are silver patrons, WineGB patrons. We have David Caldroy, who is a consultant winemaker, and Sam Lindo, who's winemaker at Camel Valley Vineyard. After their presentations, we'll have the Q&A session. To ask questions, just use the little icon at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A icon, and they will come up, and then I'll be able to read those and direct them to our speakers after their presentations. If you want to chat to everybody, then do use the chat icon on that screen. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available on the WineGB website in a few days' time. I think we have most of our attendees now, so I will not hang around and hand over to Sam Armstrong.
Hello everyone, I'm Sam. My background is from the whisky industry up in Scotland. I worked there for 6 years. And then ended up down in the wine industry with David, and now go around helping all of you guys fix your machines. And today I'm just going to go through some of the points I would advise you guys look at when it comes to maintaining, caring for all your machinery within the winery. I will fire up a PowerPoint, 2 seconds. This works. Okay, right. Someone just thumbs up if that's worked. Okay, right. First of all, when it comes to winery equipment, you guys don't have a massive amount in comparison to contract bottling plants or various other production environments, but what you do have tends to be used seasonally, which makes it a bit of a struggle to rely on it absolutely when it comes to the season of use. So where I want to make our focus that maintenance starts is straight after you've used it. From a cleaning point of view, it's a huge part of it. So any machine that you own or use, the manual will tell you what products you can and can't use to clean it, if you can use steam, power hoses, that kind of thing. And cleaning is as soon as you've finished it and are planning to pack it away for the season, for the rest of the year. That's the first thing I would advise doing, and clean it properly underneath all the gears, and read the manual. It will instruct you. It might be very complex in the way it's written, but they generally are pretty good at telling you how to go about cleaning your machine. Sometimes more clear as how to clean it than maintain it, but that's just part of having foreign machinery. Their English translation isn't always the best, but the cleaning side of things is generally quite clear. The next part is kind of month to month maintenance, even though it's packed away and it's not getting used in the winery over the months. But when the seasons change, your machine is heating up and the ambient temperature of the room is changing, and things start to seize up. Grease starts to go hard, especially if you've got a mix of grease in there, which I'll go through later as to what the do's and don'ts of mixing grease and the correct grease for machines. But as the seasons change, I would always advise unpacking it, taking it out and turning it over for a matter of hours on a maybe a 3 monthly basis, or depending on how much you're using it, and depends what it is as well. But that's a general rule of thumb is try to, if you're storing a machine for a long period of time, try turn it over as much as you can. Another part is a lot of it is belt-driven machinery. If belts are getting left for a long period of time to prolong the life of belts, they should be slackened off as before you store it away and don't use it for months on end. Just prevent it getting brittle and cracking. It's something that you find occasionally is people are changing belts fairly often, and that's pretty much the only reason is they're left under tension for a long period of time. As for maintenance, it's most of it is in the manual for your machine, but I find a lot of the time people haven't read the manual or don't understand it and haven't asked anyone about it and tend to just leave it. So the manuals will always advise the correct lubricants for your machines, and that's a huge factor of what I end up going around doing a lot is I find that people have gone online or gone to their local Halfords or B&Q and they found the cheapest option or the quickest option, and they brought it back and they use it winery wide. They use it on all their machines, and it's always the same lubricant for everything. And generally, that's a massive no. It's really, really important that you go with the lubricant or a similar lubricant that a lubricant company has recommended for your machine. They tend to have been looked at in great detail as to why they're using those lubricants, and to go and just pick up something at B&Q or Halfords or wherever it is and just fire it into your machine can cause huge damage. Over time, you probably won't notice it to start with, and then 2 years down the line, you've got a dismantling job and a refurbishment side of things to go around, which is obviously not cost effective in the slightest. You've got loads of places that can supply. If your machine is old, for example, kind of 20-year-old machine, and you're still using it day to day, and the lubricant that you've found in the manual is no longer made, or it's been replaced by something else. Generally, if you go to one manufacturer of lubricant or a distributor in the UK, they'll find, if you send them the data sheets for the previous one, they'll find a pretty good, as close as they can, that'll do the same job. But to go out, the food safe stuff is a big thing as well. A lot of people will go out and buy the first food safe lubricant they see, and that again, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to use food safe lubricant across your winery. Food safe stuff is just for anything that comes into contact with the wine. If you've got gears underneath the machine, there's no reason you have to use food safe there, and generally the non-food safe stuff lasts a lot longer. So it's something to go into and have a look at straight away, especially harvest coming up. Before harvest, just make sure you've got everything at hand, ordered up, that's relevant to the machines you're going to be using, so that if something does start breaking, you know you're at least putting the right lubricant into your machine. There is options to, if you've mixed previous greases in your machines, 2 different types, say over 2 different years, you've picked up 2 different tubes of grease and you've pumped it into your machine, or used different lubricants across the board. If you go online, there's a couple of cross-reference checkers as to that you can enter what grease you've used, the compounded grease that you've used, and you can check them against each other to make sure that they're not going to harden in any of your moving parts and cause damage, basically. If you do find that you've mixed 2 greases that aren't compatible, I would suggest giving someone a call or doing it yourself. It will have to be cleared out, and it's easier doing it before it seizes up than after. When you're cleaning machines, mentioned it at the start, but if you're using extremely hot water, steam or air sprayers or pressure washers, be really, really careful where you're putting them. If you've got moving parts, generally they're not waterproof, and anything you put down there is going to get in between grease points and bearings and moving parts. I'll show you some pictures of where things have gone wrong. Basically, chemicals have gone into grease points or broken through seals, and after an unknown amount of time, I tend to not know how long they've been left for, but it can cause damage. For example, this, and it will sit and it will just eat. Bearings aren't made out of stainless steel because they're hardened. They can't be made out of stainless steel, so they're not as corrosion resistant as stainless, and they tend to wear or break down a lot faster. You'll find pitting in them, and you'll find a huge amount of damage if you've let or used the wrong chemical in the wrong place, or high pressure or steam, and it's broken through the seal that's been made and it's not been checked, and over time all that'll happen is it'll corrode, it'll get into your bearings, and eventually it'll fail, and it can be a very expensive and very time consuming project to bring it back to working condition. I'll show you another one. This is another build-up of grease at the bottom of a machine. That is what you're looking at is grease, but just through time and constant pumping in of grease and then using chemicals to clean it, it's just turned into a corrosive mess, really. I'll take that off your screen because it's not the prettiest of things. I'd like to go through some more. So when you grease a machine or look underneath it and you don't know what you're doing or you don't know what you're looking at, but you're pumping in grease and you can see grease coming out of a point, say it's flushing through. And it might be a little bit disgusting, but if you take a grease sample, put a glove on and feel the grease, take it out of the machine, put it on a bit of blue roll and feel for any sort of contaminants or particles in the grease. If you start feeling bits of broken off metal or anything solid, it generally means they're contaminated, and it's a good idea to have them checked by someone in the area, an engineer. There's loads more to go into with maintenance, but I would say the first thing to do is go back to your manuals that you maybe got 5 or 6 years ago when you bought a machine, and look back through it and see if something clicks that maybe you've missed before or you now understand because you've used the machine for so many years that you maybe didn't understand when you first read the manual. It's worth doing, and it can prevent downtime in the future massively, and potentially kind of a refurbishment project happening, which is saves money in the long run. Another huge bit of advice I'd give you is if you can use or log as much of what you do machinery wise in the winery through some sort of, you could depending on the amount of machines you own or the amount of equipment you own, you could just use a kind of notepad type thing, or there's software out there for the small scale all the way up to the high end of things, but it'll basically asset list what you have. It allows you to enter maintenance and scheduling through it. It's called CCMS software. You might use it already for other parts of your winery, but some of them are great for maintenance. So you can enter all your machinery on one kind of app, if you will, or software, and it allows you to log every bit of work you do to it, any recurring problems over the years, say with change of winemakers or people that are using the machine. might not convey to each other the problems they've had, and then this allows you to see if you've got recurring problems with your machine. It also allows you to schedule maintenance so that you generally don't forget, it's not forgotten about, and in the long run it will make a massive difference. There's loads and loads of different options out there for CCMS software. You get a great like if you go on the comparison websites, you've got great discount on them. They're not expensive in any way whatsoever. Some of them are even free. It tends to be better to go with the paid versions, but it completely depends on the amount of assets you have in the winery. But it's definitely worth doing, and it's good to keep track of these things. I could talk forever about going through maintenance and plans, but it's generally really specific to the machine. So any questions, just fire them in at the end. Thanks for listening, and I'll pass it on to David.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for the seagull sound effects too. So if I can share my screen with you. There we go. So I'm just going to go through a few points pertinent to where we are coming up to harvest. Some general points on ordering supplies, and then a couple of subjects where I feel there's quite a bit of opportunity for the winemakers to avoid problems during fermentation, and that's yeast nutrition and yeast rehydration. And then also I'm going to briefly talk about a protocol for co-inoculation of malolactic fermentation. There is actually another webinar planned for later in the year when Brad is going to be talking about malolactic fermentation in more detail. Not to steal his thunder, but it is quite an opportune moment to think about other ways of doing it. So in terms of harvest preparation, it's important to keep in mind a few points. I mean, first of all, the production of wine in the UK is actually still quite small, and that means that the suppliers, or rather the distributors in the UK, won't be able to hold large stocks of all the myriad products that they sell. I'm sure you've all seen a huge quantity of yeast available. You can't keep large stocks of those available. So it's important to order well in advance so that you can get everything you need in time for harvest. Particularly when we're talking about liquid preparations. You know, this may be liquid preparations, fining agents, even sulfites. They have a very limited shelf life. And so the manufacturers themselves won't have large stocks. You can quite often get caught out if you're not prepared. Keep in mind that August is a traditional holiday period, so transport becomes problematic. This has become particularly difficult this year. We're finding much longer transit times than we normally have, just because of COVID. Whether it's an excuse or they have fewer drivers, it is problematic. And then, of course, in the future, we actually have to consider, are there going to be further delays to transportation with Brexit? I know Sam Lindo is not actually getting particularly good weather down in Cornwall, but for those of us in Sussex and Kent, the blistering heat actually raises another consideration, and that is you need to be prepared for seasonal anomalies. This caught me out once in the past where the country I was working in had an insufficient supply of tartaric acid, which caused major problems. In the UK, it's probably more likely to be lack of double salt. Well, you always could live, hopefully. So, you know, even things like a particularly wet year with a high fungal pressure, you might want to be adding tannins to your wine as another antioxidant to boost the capability of SO2. And if everyone's doing exactly the same thing, then the stocks will run out quite quickly. And finally, check the expiry date of the existing stock you have. This will normally be in the form of a DLUO. And if it is going to be out of date, then obviously you can't use it. On that note, yeast is probably one of the key ones that you may have in stock, and has a relatively short shelf life, a couple of years normally for most manufacturers. how you store the yeast will have an effect on its viability. Generally, you don't need to store it in a refrigerator. But if you stored it somewhere warm where the temperature frequently goes over 20 degrees C, you will actually lose viability. I tend to work on a ratio of adding 20% extra yeast for the previous year's yeast and 40% for the vintage of the year beforehand. But if you've got any packets of yeast which have been opened from the previous year, don't use them. They will lose viability very, very quickly, and even if you manage to rehydrate them and get the culture going, it's probably going to cause you problems further down the line. And as a good rule of thumb is once you're doing the rehydration, if it looks inactive, it probably is. It's just better to start again with a new inoculum. So on to yeast nutrition. This is an area where the winemaker actually has a capability of avoiding problems in the future. And there's a few things which are probably not understood as well as they should be. And people just think, oh, just open the yeast, bung it in, it should be bright. And then have problems later on with reduction or stuck ferments. And it's important to consider that yeast is actually a facultative anaerobe. So it can respire anaerobically to produce alcohol, but it also can respire aerobically. And aerobic is its preferential type of metabolism. And if it's respiring anaerobically, then there are certain metabolic pathways that don't actually happen. In particular, the synthesis of sterols, which are necessary for the membrane and the yeast cell. And if there are insufficient sterols, then the membrane will not function properly, and then you get problems as I was describing. There's various different factors which affect fermentation, yeast during fermentation, yeast viability, temperature, alcohol, dissolved oxygen, pesticides, residues, SO2. And what I want to talk about now is nitrogen, because this is one area where you can actually make a difference. Oops. So it's essential for protein synthesis. It's a key requirement. You can't do without it. There are natural forms of nitrogen. There'll be proteins, peptides, amino acid ions, alpha amino acids. But there's two different types of nitrogen. There's free ammonium nitrogen, and there's also alpha amino acids. And they come from different sources and have quite some significant different implications. Before I go into details on that, just want to look at where your nitrogen requirements will vary according to your vinification protocol. The temperature of fermentation will have a key effect, as will the dissolved oxygen level. If you've got more dissolved oxygen, then you have a higher requirement. The initial sugar content or the potential alcohol will have an effect. The turbidity of the yeast will have an effect as well. And then also the yeast strain. Oops. Sorry, I've got my slides out of order. I'll talk about yeast strain in just half a moment. Yeast available nitrogen is normally present in juice ranging levels from 60 to 500 milligrams per litre. That's quite exceptional to be that high. In the UK, the levels tend to be around about 100 to 300 milligrams per litre. It does depend on the season. It is affected considerably by the climate, by the grape variety, by your soil type, foliar feeds. So you can't just adopt a rule of thumb that, okay, 200 milligrams per litre is what we have. You need to have some sort of track record. You have to have some knowledge of how your vineyard fares compared to others, how the variety fares compared to others, and to take that into account when you're making your nutrition decisions. So that begs the question, do you analyze your grape juice for YAN? I would say yes, it is an important analysis because it gives you a benchmark. It knows where, you know where you're looking at, but you need to consider some very important facts. Firstly, YAN is rapidly taken up by yeast. FAN, that's the amino acid nitrogen, is rapidly metabolized by yeast. So if you send a juice sample off to a lab, or even in your own lab to have it analyzed, and you leave it sitting around for any period of time, there's a strong possibility that the natural yeast in that sample will start to metabolize and take up the yan, and the results that you get back will be meaningless. So make sure you take from fresh juice samples, preferably clarified. That could be just a little lab centrifuge or a little lab filter, just to remove any wild yeast. And make sure that the delivery is done as quickly as possible and the analysis comes as quickly as possible. Once again, if it's sitting around in a post office over the weekend or on the bench of a laboratory, there's a strong possibility that you won't get a meaningful result. In terms of how you get the analysis done, if people who have spectrophotometers now have the ability with little kits, for wineries without a spectrophotometer, then there are external laboratories who will provide the service, BRI Camden and Custom Crush, to name but two. Sending the samples abroad to get your yan analysis done, it's probably a waste of time and money. By the time they get there, the results will be zero. So I said that there's an important point of difference between amino acid nitrogen and ammonium ions. And this is something that people quite often don't actually take into account correctly. And these points are really very, very important. So for amino acid, anything present in the juice will be taken up by the yeast cells and actually accumulated and stored within the yeast cells. And then the yeast will use that form of nitrogen as and when it needs it. And it's used for various different pathways of protein synthesis. However, as the alcohol level starts to rise, then yeast cannot take up amino acid nitrogen. The other form, ammonium ions, cannot be accumulated. It is used pretty much instantaneously by the yeast. And it's best to think of amino acid ions as junk food, McDonald's. The yeast will just gobble it up very quickly and then will be hungry almost straight away. In fact, you can actually be counterproductive, because if you add too much, then you increase the biomass, thereby increasing the number of cells and thereby increasing the demand for nitrogen. Adding nitrogen, yeast development nitrogen, is different ways for adding the different forms. So you have diammonium phosphate to add ammonium ions, and you have ammonium sulfate. Some people use ammonium sulfate at harvest because it is a combination of an antioxidant, rather than an aseptic, and nitrogen. Amino acid nitrogen tends to be yeast derived. There's various different manufacturing processes used by the producers to create these products. And you will find out in the market a wide range of different products, either as pure diammonium phosphate or as pure yeast derivatives or as blends. And they tend to be designed for different stages of fermentation, different applications. So in terms of timing of additions, I would generally recommend that pre-fermentation you add amino acid nitrogen, and you only add ammoniacal nitrogen if the yan is very, very low. And that's going to be quite an unusual situation. And I would be surprised to see that in the UK. A very blistering hot climate, yes, possibly. Then during fermentation, add ammoniacal nitrogen if you have a yeast strain with a very high yan requirement and you can't add sufficient yan through amino acid nitrogen. If you get reduction problems, and if you do have to add it during the fermentation, it's far better to add a little and often, just adding very small dose rates on a frequent basis. If you add a large amount, just because it's easier, you will do, as I said earlier, just increase the biomass. You may have a fermentation which is badly reduced. You add DAP, it smells sweet as rose the next day, and then the day after it's gone back to exactly how it was beforehand. So it's better to just drip feed the fermentation. I was going to talk about I missed a slide out on this, I'm afraid. Looking at the differences of yeast requirements. So generally manufacturers tend to classify yeast strains according to their nitrogen requirement in four different categories. Low requirement being 150 milligrams per litre, medium 200, high 300, and very high 400 milligrams per litre. It's also worth mentioning that how you handle your nitrogen is not just a question of avoiding problems. You do have the ability to influence the sensory profile. Obviously, avoidance of off flavors is one key area, but adding higher quantities can actually provide beneficial results. With certain yeast strains, if you feed them with nitrogen, they will produce higher levels of fermentation esters. It's a trick that's been used in Australia to produce aromatic, well, not aromatic, but wines with aroma from Thompson Cevers, from Sultana, just by feeding the juice with lots of nitrogen, the ferment with lots of nitrogen. But also, there is a danger that if you add too much, you can start to get some solvent type characteristics, sort of nail varnish remover, too much isoamyl acetate. So there is a downside of adding too much ammoniacal nitrogen. However, with amino acid nitrogen, there's less of a chance that's going to, well, there's very little chance that's going to happen. And adding a high quantity of that will increase the floral and fruity aromas. So linked into yeast nutrition is another area where I think there's room for improvement, and that's yeast rehydration. I just want to present to you the protocol that I've developed over the years, which differs slightly from what is printed on the side of the packet of yeast by the manufacturers. And I'm sure the yeast packets tend to have a simplified version because the more complicated you make it, the less likely it's going to be followed. But again, you have to consider what you're doing and what the issue is. And during the manufacturing process of dried yeast, it's very, very stressful for the yeast cell. The membrane becomes very leaky, and the yeast is not as robust as it will be during fermentation. And if you just bung it in a tank of wine, the likelihood is you're going to have problems. So the first stage is step one is basically to rehydrate your yeast in warm water, so blood temperature more or less. It should be chlorine free because that will affect the viability, either through a carbon filter or buying deionized water, or even just boiling it the day beforehand. You need a little bit of sugar, and that is partly for a food source, but at this stage of the rehydration, it's more to create an isotonic solution so that the yeast, when it's rehydrating, doesn't lose all the cell organelles from the inside the cell, again increasing viability. This is also a very good time to add micronutrient preparations. All the manufacturers have these. They are proprietary blends. They won't tell you what's in them. Again, they tend to be produced from yeast. But because the yeast cell is slightly leaky, you can actually get stuff in as well as stuff leaking out. Mix it so there's no clumping. I've seen some recommendations where people say just scatter the yeast on the surface of the water, which is quite ridiculous because you get dry yeast on the top and yeast on the bottom layer, which is rehydrated unequally, and it's not a good way of doing it. And then you just wait for 15 minutes for it to acclimatize. And then you need to go through a process of gradually bringing down the temperature of the inoculum to close to that of the fermentation. So starting off with just a little bit of juice to give it something more to feed on, to bring the temperature down. And then every 10 minutes or so, just reduce the temperature by no more than 5 degrees with some more juice. Wait, do it again, doing it again, doing it again. It sounds a lot of faff, but it's considerably less than trying to get a stuck fermentation started again. And since I've been doing this, I've had no fermentation problems at all. Okay, so I said I wanted to talk about co-inoculation for malolactic fermentation, principally because there are big pluses to be had by adding malolactic bacteria at this stage of the wine production process. Principally because if your alcohol level is lower, then the probability of the fermentation, the malolactic fermentation starting is going to be much higher. Secondly, of course, the temperature is likely to be quite a bit warmer, especially if you're fermenting at a fairly high temperature, which is a common practice for sparkling wine production. So there's 3 distinct steps that need to be done. The first of all is the reactivation. And you need to plan your harvest quite well for this, because it needs to be done in advance. As you'll see later, the entire process lasts about 10 days. So it is helpful to have some juice that you can actually start the whole process off with at an earlier stage, so that you are doing your co-inoculation at the very beginning of alcoholic fermentation. It must be with juice without SO2, because that will reduce the viability. And you need to keep it warm at about 25 degrees C. So the first reactivation stage is about sort of 0.2% of the total volume, and it will take about 3 days. At the same time, sorry, that is an example of the reactivation media. So if we're talking about 100 hectolitres of wine, you've got a combination of must, grape juice, water, nutrients, yeast, and bacteria. At the same time, you need to start by preparing the propagation media. Again, it requires clear juice, but this needs to be deacidified with potassium bicarbonate. You don't need to rack off any sediment, just add the potassium bicarbonate to drop down the acidity. If you've got really, really high acid juice, then maybe 3 grams per litre will be necessary. Again, the temperature needs to be maintained around 23 degrees C, and it represents 3% of the final volume. And this is the makeup of the second part. So you're adding juice, yeast to ferment it, and nutrients. Then after about 3 days, you are adding the reactivation culture to the propagation culture, which you start at the same time. And this is your base malolactic inoculum. This stage of the process from day 1 is around about 8 days later, 8 to 10, does depend on the temperature. If you have the ability to monitor malolactic fermentation through malic acid level or lactic acid level, then the optimum time to add it to the bulk wine is after about 2/3 of the malic acid has been consumed. Basically when the bacteria are at their most active and most likely to achieve a sound malolactic fermentation. It is, as I said at the beginning, it is quite complicated. That looks pretty simple on one page, but if you've got multiple varieties and multiple ferments, timing the whole process can be a bit of a nightmare. And I would suggest that if anyone's doing this for the first time, they don't try and do it on everything. They just start off on maybe a later variety. So, start with one of your later varieties, but use juice from one of the early varieties to start your propagation culture. There are variations on this as well. Once you've got the ferment going, it is conceivable, once you started the propagation culture going, it's conceivable that after 8 days, you draw off some of that quantity and then increase with more juice, more nutrients, and just propagate the second batch. The plus side is that it is quite possible to get a malolactic fermentation finished pretty soon after alcoholic fermentation, and you avoid the angst of trying to get it going again, the energy bills in the winery, and the severe oxidation risk of keeping a wine without sulfites when it's warm. So I think that's basically all I have to say. Sam's now going to head off with a few points, and I'll leave you in his capable hands.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks very much, David. So yeah, I'll just going to talk about a few things. So yeah, I'm Sam Lindo from Camel Valley. We normally crush anywhere between 120 and 300 tons a year. So the stuff I say is kind of relevant to our size, but hopefully, if you're bigger or smaller, you'll find some useful tips. So, preparing for harvest. So yeah, when will harvest occur? Capacity planning, health and safety, ice, and other contingencies is what I'll talk about. Yeah, when will harvest happen? Just before I say that, you know, we're talking about organising picking and everything now. I think if you are using contract picking companies, then I think it's a conversation that you need to have with them at the very beginning of the year, because they maybe, you know, they have to know how many staff they're going to take on and know how much they're generally going to be expected to pick for the season. So it will help them planning and help you. There's no good bringing them up really now and saying that you'd like some grapes picked. So yeah, harvest, it can vary, but yeah, maybe 110, 120 days after flowering. So as soon as flowering's happened for each variety, you can then start to pencil in when things are going to generally come in and see how congested or spread out the harvest is going to be, depending on what the different vineyards say. And then 45 days after veraison is another good time when you'll start to write in a slightly more permanent pencil. And then nearer the time, two sort of key things depending on what you want the grapes to be. But yeah, the acid seems to drop about 0.3 per day. And the Ursula, it seems to increase 1 a day. And so what that means is, you know, normally the beginning of September, you can book your transport, book the pickers. You kind of know what day you're going to pick, because if it's sunny, the acid does drop that much, and then if it rains, it still drops that much. So for us, we're often really picking on acidity, because there's kind of no going back really with acidity if it becomes too low. And then the other thing about starting, if you don't start a harvest early enough, you can't go back. You know, you could end up not being able to pick everything in time and losing the acidity, or maybe you know, the grapes being received in poorer conditions. I think when you're making sparkling wine in particular, I think you can pick a few things earlier and get something in the bank, and then it does allow you to let the harvest spread out a little bit more. So yeah, depending on how congested the harvest is going to be, yeah, you could think about starting to pick early enough. Capacity, really obvious. Size of harvest is tank space. So normally once flowering has happened, we'll be making sure that we've got the tank space. And also it's probably the last time you can order tanks to get them from somewhere abroad and to be here in time for the harvest. But then there's other things that happen in the harvest. So there's pressing capacity. Yeah, if you're running things 24 hours a day, there is a limit to what you can actually process. And so, you know, when the flowering dates come in, you can start to decide whether, you know, what your capacity is. And also knowing that capacity means that if you have to make any fast decisions in harvest, you know that you can take extra grapes in, or you definitely can't take things in. So I think you really have to understand the capacity of the winery with respect to that. But there's other things to bear in mind. Just while we're on that, are you going to have, you know, long shifts or 2 shifts? So the good thing about long shifts is you're all kind of quite busy all the time, and you get really good at things. The downside is, particularly if you're digging out cockard presses, it's pretty tiring. And then 2 shifts, you can have 2 8-hour shifts, and then they can spread into 2 12-hour shifts. So sometimes a big harvest can actually be easier because you've got 2 shifts, but then it does mean a lot of extra non-permanent staff coming to help out. And then settling or flotation capacity is something else to think about. And then cooling. So maybe you're cooling the juice as well as cooling fermentations. So you want to make sure that your chiller is up to it's got enough power, and that you can do what you expect that you would need to do during the harvest, because it's not very nice when you've got warming ferments and not cold juice, or not for us anyway. Transfers and additions, we normally find that they're all things that fit in the day-to-day with actually processing the grapes for a winery our size. And then lees recovery, you may or may not do it. It is something that we do, but yeah, it's you can build up lees if you're not recovering it quick enough. So it's another thing that might affect the capacity, or that you have to think about. Safety, it's a really big thing for us with harvest. You know, we want to have a successful harvest and no one get injured. So we normally have a harvest safety briefing. So I put standard operating procedures and policies as well. So we all have them. We all have a great big folder loads of stuff on how to do everything, all the health and safety risk assessments and things like that. And if you give someone, a new person coming to work for you, it'll probably take them a good few weeks to really kind of get through it, and they probably won't remember any of it. So we really like to have this harvest safety briefing where we go through specifically the things that that we really want people to concentrate on, and as you see, they sign and attend it. So among the discussion is, you know, CO2, probably one of the things that we have to be most vigilant about, and so everyone has to be really clear on the operating procedures if you don't have CO2 alarms. Also, if you do have CO2 alarms, what you're going to do, and also the different working times that you have based on the amount of CO2 in the room. So there are things that everyone has to know exist, even if they're not going to step in the winery, because if they do just step in the winery accidentally, yeah, they need to be aware of what's going on. The other thing we like to say is the forklift. It is I would say the most dangerous thing that we have in the winery, because you know, it's very easy to get hurt if someone is hit by a forklift, and so we like to talk about the forklift and, you know, highlight that if anyone sees anyone not using it properly, then feel free to say, because we're quite happy to pull anyone up on it. So really let us know about that. Customers, for us, we have people visiting us, and yeah, with the best signage, they can end up everywhere. So we really have to be alert to anyone walking around the winery. And then new one for us, allergen handling and cross-contamination. We now have no food areas, and people can't consume nuts in these areas, or snacks, or things like that, because it can affect, you know, it can contaminate the wine for all the way down through the process. And some people can be allergic to nuts that have been through nut protein that will go through a cross-flow filter. So it is something that we now have to start being wary of. We talk about the elevator, the crusher, they're pretty easy things. And then the next thing is the press, the doors, and cleaning the press. So we do have a standard operating procedure. We train everyone to do it, but we do also in the briefing go through, you know, unplugging the press. Don't get inside the press unless it's unplugged, and telling other people that you've got inside the press, and things like that. Electrics, another thing, you know, equipment can pretty easily get damaged. Everyone's rushing around in harvest and pulling sockets out and things like that. So always keep an eye on the electrics. There's a lot of water going around, so if anyone sees any damaged sockets, the cables coming out, is a pet hate of mine when people just carry on using stuff without getting it fixed. And also it's a time when we mentioned about quarantining things that have got something wrong with them, so they're not, people don't just pick them up to use them without knowing that there is a problem. We don't generally use caustic and peracetic acid for us in the winery during harvest, but it is something to alert people of, that those are the chemicals that people have to worry about. We generally steam tanks and everything during harvest. It's a massive time saver. It just takes, you know, 5 to 10 minutes to clean a tank with steam, sterilize it, and so yeah, we don't have anyone whose job it is just cleaning tanks anymore. We have jet wash, headphones. We have different scenarios for headphones that we talk about. Ladders, wet floors, tractors, like the forklift, and how picking works. And then also with lorries, lorries just turn up for us. We know they're coming, but yeah, they just turn up. So everyone needs to know how to park them, what's happening with unloading, and if we need a banksman, if there's customers around, and things like that. And then at the bottom is a reminder for us to check or do our pre-harvest equipment checks and make sure they're carried out and signed. So this is just the start of the list. Winery hoses, clean, no leaks, defects, and pumps. So in particular, we've got the electric cables and a few other things to safety guarding on the machine. But by us going through the checklist, it means people are already kind of checking throughout harvest because we've already been through the checklist, so they know what they're checking. So that's a useful thing that we do. And then we've got a record that everything was safe the last time we checked it, which is very important. And then ice in case of emergency. So most of the kit that we use in the winery isn't anything special, and there's nothing really that can't be fixed by someone locally. So we have an electrician and an electrical engineer that is happy to be called 24 hours a day, and if we need to, and also mechanical engineers. Having said that, everyone likes to have a go at fixing things in the winery, which is fine. As an owner, I can do whatever I want with electrics. If I kill myself, it's my own fault, but we can't send any staff in and let them play around with things without having a little training thing about they can't look at things with it being on and things like that. So we have to get someone in, but I generally do try to be there most of the time. And you're probably aware, a lot of equipment now has the Siemens control panels. And we do find that all of our suppliers are quite happy for a local person to dial in and if there's any reprogramming that needs to be done. So we haven't hit any snags yet. Although now things are supplied with Wi-Fi connections, and it can be done remotely in Italy or France or wherever the engineer is. So it's things are changing very fast. And then finally, the COVID risk. I'm sure all of you have already been working safely, and you've got a lot of protocols in place for working together. So I won't go into the specifics of the winery, but the things can change very quickly. And at the moment, where the track and trace is becoming a bit more effective, and there's a fair chance that you could be shut down because one of your members of staff has had coronavirus symptoms, or someone else has been told to isolate, or someone that you've been in contact, and it could affect the whole team. So we haven't decided what we're going to do yet, but do you have two separate teams? That always works separately. So if one team has to isolate for some reason, then the other team can carry on doing everything in one shift. Or does somebody live on site and will be staying at home? So that's my dad currently. He may have to do the whole harvest on his own if the single team has to isolate during harvest. And finally, no harvest is ever the same. It's every year you think, well, we've seen this, it's going to be like this harvest or that harvest, but it very annoyingly never turns out that way. So you've always got to think on your feet, and good luck. Hope you have a good harvest. So thanks very much, and Joe, over to you for questions.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much to Sam Armstrong, David, and also Sam Lindo. In fact, you must have covered everything off because we don't have any questions from our participants. Unless anybody wants to ping up a question now.
Sleep.
No, we haven't got any questions, so well done covering it off there. So again, thank you very much to the three of you. That was really good, and thank you everyone for participating. I just want to remind you that we're doing a COVID-specific winery sort of health and safety session next Tuesday. That's the 18th, but at 10 o'clock in the morning, because we have someone dialing in from Australia who's obviously experienced it this year. So please do sign up for that. This one's being recorded, so it will be available in the next few days. So I will say goodbye now, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joe.